Act.
Debate, débat. The honourable member for Surrey North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, it's an honour to rise in this House to speak on behalf of my constituents from Surrey North. Mr. Speaker, I'll be speaking on Bill C-46, an act to amend the National Energy Board Act and the Canada Oil and Gas Operations Act. Essentially, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-46 amends the statutory liability regime for federally regulated pipelines in Canada. The bill includes absolute liability for all National Energy Board regulated pipelines. Basically, it means that companies will be liable for costs and damages irrespective of fault up to $1 billion for major oil pipelines that have the capacity to transport at least 250 barrels a day. They would continue to have unlimited liability when they are at fault or negligent. Mr. Speaker, essentially this bill is a much needed and a long overdue first step towards a true polluter pay regime for pipelines in Canada. And the official opposition, the NDP, has been calling on this government to bring in a legislation so that we have a true polluter pay system in this country. Mr. Speaker, I think the Conservatives understand what a polluter pay is. However, I think they're reluctant to make it happen in Canada. I think Canadians understand that, what a polluter pay is. Even my own children, they understand that, Mr. Speaker, what a polluter pay means. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are they're choosing not to understand what polluter pays means to protect their friends in the oil companies, their friends that are damaging the very environment of Canada, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think Canadians understand what a polluter pay is. And as I pointed out, my own children, they understand that if you make a mess, you clean it up. It's not next generation that cleans up that mess. And I'll share a story of my children to demonstrate that, Mr. Speaker. I have two children. I have a son who's 8 years old, and I have a daughter who is 18, Jessica. And my son, a typical 8-year-old, he makes a mess, and whether it's toys and paint and lots of other stuff, as it is in every Canadian household, children do make mess at home. And so, one afternoon, there's toys and huge mess in the living room, and the mother, my wife, asked Jaren, the 8-year-old, say, Jaren, can you clean up that mess you made from playing with all your friends and the toys that were in the living room? And he looks at her and he looks at my daughter. He said, oh, Jessica will clean it up for me. And Jessica looks at him and she say, no, Jaren, you made the mess, you clean it up. And he went running to the mom. He said, Jessica, Mom, Jessica won't clean up the mess. And the mom told him, said, Jaren, it's your mess, you have to clean this up. And he understood that. He got up and he knew that it was his mess, that he needs to clean this up. Very basic concept, Mr. Speaker, is if you make a mess, you clean it up. Whoever makes a mess cleans it up. Unfortunately, the Conservatives believe that if their friends in the oil industry make a mess, if there's a pipeline, eruption or pipeline is damaged, they expect not the oil companies to clean it up. They expect Canadian taxpayers to clean it up, Mr. Speaker. How fair is that? If an 8-year-old, and most Canadians understand the concept of polluter pay, why can't the Conservatives understand that, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I think they understand it. Again, I think they're trying to protect their friends in the oil industry to have this liability put on Canadian taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this particular bill is the first step in regards to polluter pay. Unfortunately, the implementation of many of the proposed changes in Bill C-46 is left to the discretion of the National Energy Board and Cabinet, or the details are left to regulations. Mr. Speaker, C-46 leaves considerable leeway for politically motivated decisions and backroom arrangements between operators and the National Energy Board, a regulator that lacks credibility on the pipeline front. We are all therefore left with uncertainty as to whether this bill goes far enough. Mr. Speaker, I come from British Columbia, and we've seen the opposition to the Northern Gateway pipeline, and we know the mess that the National Energy Board has created, where legitimate people didn't have, they weren't allowed to testify or make their presentations from the National Energy Board. And the Conservatives have put in so many roadblocks to have a fair process where, Mr. Speaker, if we are going to have pipelines, there has to be a clear process in place to ensure that all of the considerations are taken into place before a decision is made. And we know, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have made a mockery of the process, and they've gutted the very environmental regulations that are supposed to be protecting not only our environment but also our resource sectors in this country, Mr. Speaker. I think they've failed to take a leadership role to show that some of these projects are viable, and that we take into consideration the environmental regulations, the environmental guidelines to ensure that if we have these projects, that we protect them. Again, the polluter pay system is something foreign. Well, again, Mr. Speaker, it's not really foreign to the Conservatives. They just choose to be on the sides of the oil companies instead of being sides of the taxpayers, Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it certainly is a first step. Bill C-46 makes some important improvements to Canada's liability regime, but the lack of certainty about the degree to which polluters will be required to pay undermines these improvements and leaves uncertainty as to whether the taxpayer would be still on the hook for cleanup costs greater than $1 billion when fault or negligence cannot be proven. Mr. Speaker, we've seen $1 billion is like a drop in a bucket when it comes to major oil spills. We've seen the cost of these oil spills much more than a drop in the bucket, $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. There needs to be more to protect, to ensure that Canadians and taxpayers from Surrey North are not left with holding the bag that the Conservatives are passing on from their friends from the oil companies to the taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. And that is not fair, and is something that Canadians expect us parliamentarians to ensure that liability stays with the polluter, not with the taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to profits, when it comes to profit, the oil companies will gladly make sure that they take those profits, and the Conservatives actually help the oil companies. If they lose money, they socialize it, they nationalize that loss on backs of the taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. And I can assure you, people from my constituency clearly would not want that to happen, Mr. Speaker. And I've talked to many people in my constituency who are wanting a system in place where we ensure that liability stays with the polluter, not with the taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know I've got a minute left. I can go on this subject because I know it's a very much concern to people in my constituency. But basically, Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt that Canada's natural resources are a tremendous blessing, and the energy sector is driving force of our economy. The NDP vision, Mr. Speaker, for leveraging those resources to create wealth and prosperity does not sacrifice social or environmental sustainability. So the vision of the official opposition could be, Mr. Speaker, summed up in three key principles: sustainability, to make sure that the polluters pay for pollution; they create instead of leaving costs to the next generations. Secondly, partnerships to make sure that communities provide provinces and First Nations all benefit from resource development, and that we create value-added middle-class high-paying jobs in Canada, Mr. Speaker. And the third component is a long-term prosperity to leverage Canada's natural wealth to invest in modern, clean energy technologies that will keep Canada on the cutting edge of energy development and ensure affordable rates into the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question.